Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 more horrifying cave stories. The first story actually takes place in the infamous Nutty Putty Cave, but it is not about John Jones. And the final story is about the worst possible thing you can imagine seeing miles deep into a massive cave. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The story of the tragic death of John Jones inside Utah's Nutty Putty Cave is one of the most well-known caving incidents ever. In fact, if you've followed the channel for some time, you've probably heard me refer to it on at least several occasions. Whether it's the horror and hopelessness of the situation he found himself in, or that John was a young man with a pregnant wife at the time, something about the final 24 hours of his life strikes a chord with so many people. If it's a story you're not familiar with, John was a 26-year-old aspiring pediatrician who entered Nutty Putty Cave on November 24, 2009 during a visit with family for Thanksgiving. John was exploring with his brother, crawling along a section of his stomach when he thought he reached an area of the cave called the birth canal. This area was named for its tight quarters and because it looks like you were being born when you came out the other side. About the only areas more dangerous than the birth canal were the fissures along the main tunnel just beyond another area known as the Big Slide, and that's exactly where John ended up. With a steep drop to a tight dead end, it was too late by the time John realized his error. Horrifyingly, he couldn't push his way back up, and a massive rescue effort to get him out of the cave failed when John's heart gave out. Humans simply aren't meant to be upside down for long periods of time because blood will start to pool in the brain, which means the heart has to pump harder to fight the effects of gravity. Over a long enough period of time, no matter how young or in shape someone is, the heart becomes so overworked that it stops. After John was confirmed dead, the decision was made to leave his body in the cave. Less than 10 days after he passed away, the entrance to Nutty Putty Cave was sealed shut with concrete, ensuring that no one will ever enter it again. What most retellings of his story omit, however, is that John's death was the last straw for Nutty Putty Cave. When it was open, the cave attracted all kinds of adventure seekers when it probably should have been a place restricted to experienced cavers only. It was most popular with Boy Scouts and high school and college students, and there were a series of emergencies and close calls that the city, county, and state officials had to devote resources to. Between the year 2000 and 2005 alone, 7 rescue missions were conducted at Nutty Putty Cave, averaging more than 1 per year. In 2004, 16-year-old Brock Clark was rescued from what is possibly the same fissure John's body now occupies. 2 weeks later, 23-year-old David Crowther got himself stuck for 8 hours before being rescued. Then in 2001, 2 Boy Scouts made it to some of the deepest reaches of the cave beyond the birth canal before getting stuck. Thankfully, it took rescuers only 4 hours to get them free, and then ironically, the area the Boy Scouts were trapped in was named the Scout Eater after the incident. Fortunately, most of the rescue missions conducted at Nutty Putty Cave since it was first explored in 1960 had happy endings, but emergency personnel and government officials knew that good fortune would eventually run out, and that's what happened when John's became the last in a string of rescue missions that drained resources. 10 years before John's death, 2 17-year-olds were almost the ones who sealed Nutty Putty's fate and entrance. Chris Morrow and Chris Hale love the outdoors, and with this being the final summer break of their high school lives, they planned to squeeze as much out of it as they could. Along with a group of friends, the Salt Lake City teens drove south nearly 70 miles or 113 kilometers to the parking area for Nutty Putty Cave. The plan was that the group would camp in the area that night and then head into the cave the next morning, so they got their tents set up and settled in for the night. The next morning, around 9 o'clock, the group entered the cave, and after some preliminary exploring, Morrow and Hale split off from the group and headed for the birth canal, located about 120 feet or 37 meters underground. After crawling the tight passages for a while, with Morrow leading the way, they believed they had reached the birth canal and they began pushing their way in, but Morrow turned into the wrong tunnel. As he did, he entered the downward slope headfirst on his stomach. He then started pushing his way through, sucking in his stomach as he needed to when the surrounding rock would squeeze his entire body almost to a complete stop. Hales was right behind him and already well into descending the tunnel when Morrow realized they had made a horrible mistake. Looking ahead with his flashlight, Morrow could see nothing but rock walls. It was a dead end. Morrow then called back to Hales to let him know what he had just learned and to tell him to backtrack, but he was also in big trouble. He had curled himself into a ball by bringing his knees up to his chest as he tried to crawl through the fissure, and it got him wedged in place. This meant that both of them were completely stuck in the tunnel, upside down with no way to free themselves. Thankfully, their friends found them as a result of their screams and left the cave to call for help. and within an hour, about 40 rescuers arrived to begin trying to free the teens. While the effort was getting organized outside, Morrow and Hales received food and water from their friends, but it wasn't too long before rescuers were inside the cave and on their way to the two boys. Before anything though, rescuers needed to assess the situation, and they asked Morrow and Hales a handful of questions about their respective positions and how they were feeling. Several hours passed with little noticeable activity above them, but the two friends kept their spirits high. They chatted with one another, prayed together, and even made fun of themselves for ending up in that situation. When one of them would start to feel panic coming on, the other was there to calm him down. Outside the cave, it wouldn't be until late afternoon when Morrow's mother was notified about her son being trapped. As soon as she learned about what happened, she headed right for Nutty Putty Cave. Throughout the drive, she kept thinking about when she said goodbye to him the day before. She was visibly worried, and he did his best to ease her concerns, telling her that what he was planning to do was totally safe. Back inside the cave, after understanding the situation better, rescuers believed that the best way to get them out would be to pull them up with a rope attached to their feet. A member of the rescue team then slid down to Hales and tied a rope around his ankles before being pulled back up. When the fissure was clear, rescuers pulled while Hales wiggled his way free of the jutting rocks that had been poking in the back since the morning. Around 10:30 p.m., 12 hours after getting stuck, Hales was finally free. It would take a few more hours to get Morrow out, but he joined his friend outside to receive medical attention. The boys hugged and shared another laugh about the situation that could have had a far worse ending. Both of them managed to escape with just a few minor scrapes and scratches. Morrow even said afterward that he had continued telling himself that he wasn't claustrophobic to keep himself from losing his cool. If you're wondering whether or not he became claustrophobic as a result of his experience, Morrow actually returned to Nutty Putty Cave 2 more times before it was finally sealed shut in 2009. On one of those visits, he even went back to the same spot he got stuck in, but he made it out without incident. Unfortunately, not every caving incident ends so well. May 14th, 2022 was a beautiful spring day in Chiefland, Florida, with clear skies and a nice cool breeze that made its balmy temperatures much more tolerable. The area is home to Manatee Springs State Park, and as its name suggests, some of the park's waters are often inhabited by manatees, which brings in many tourists. One of its biggest attractions, however, is the underwater cave system, which was believed to be one of the longest in the world at one time. And with more than 20,000 known caves within the system, which also connects to a handful of sinkholes from the surface, Manatee Springs State Park is a mecca of sorts for cave divers. And this is exactly what drew 2 father-son teams there late in the morning on May 14th. Now, in the literature about this incident, none of the divers are named, so they've been assigned pseudonyms to prevent confusion. The 4 divers were cave certified, but only in the Intro to Caves course. However, with 100 dives each, they felt confident in taking on such a challenging dive. They actually got the idea while watching a YouTube video of a dive in the Manatee Springs cave system. At several points in the video they watched, the narrator acknowledges that their particular dive plan went against cave diver training, but because so many divers had done it before, it was worth the risk for, quote, a thrill every cave diver should experience, end quote. This was unfortunately all the encouragement the 4 divers needed, and watching the video was the extent of their research on the cave system. They never looked at a map or talked to any other divers who had been in the Manatee Springs system before. Instead, all they used was what they remembered from watching the video. The area they plan to dive consists of 3 sinkholes that are connected through underground tunnels, so the dive would be a type called a traverse, which is when divers enter in one place and exit in another. They'd enter the system through the Friedman sink, which only has a 4-foot wide shaft that drops into the tunnel system. From there, they'd swim downstream and pass through another sinkhole called the Sioux sink, which is an emergency-only exit since it was located in a campground area strictly for campers. Beyond Sioux Sink, they'd exit through an area known as Catfish Hotel, which is the most popular entrance to the cave system and one of the largest sinkholes in the park. The distance they'd cover would be about 1,712 feet or 522 meters, and for that distance, the 4 divers each brought 2 side-mounted cylinders of air filled to 3,800 psi. This is because, depending on how tight the tunnels of a cave system are, cave divers can wear tanks on their sides instead of their backs to give themselves a slimmer profile. They also brought primary and backup lights, and the 2 fathers had video cameras with floodlights fixed to them. Finally, around 11:15 a.m. that morning, they entered Friedman Sink and split into 2 teams of 2, which is how they usually configured their dives. The 2 sons, who we'll call Billy and Mike, led the way, and their fathers, who we'll call John and Dave, followed in behind. As they made their way through the tunnels, they followed along the permanent guideline, which is a length of rope attached to the entrance that can help a cave diver find their way in the event of emergency or low visibility. Guidelines can also help divers navigate through complex systems that have a lot of forks and offshoots. As they made their way through, the interior of the tunnel was as spectacular and every bit the thrill the video's narrator promised. When they reached Sioux Sink, they continued on and picked up another guideline that would lead them to their exit at Catfish Hotel. Near the end of the line, however, Billy and Mike stopped as they approached a dark cloud in the distance. Visibility was near zero ahead, and between sediment suspended in the water and the pitch-black darkness their lights barely penetrated, they weren't sure where they were or where to go. John and Dave arrived soon after and were just as clueless. After sitting there for a moment, Billy decided he'd swim through the silt a bit and see if visibility was any better ahead, but he only got about a body's length from the others before he thought better of it and turned around. Getting lost in the silt would be incredibly dangerous. He then pulled out his underwater slate and wrote the word Manatee on it, followed by a question mark. Beyond Catfish Hotel is the park's namesake, Manatee Springs, and the waters there are off limits to divers. What Billy believed was that maybe they had accidentally bypassed Catfish Hotel and that they were in the tunnel heading to Manatee Springs instead. Unbeknownst to them, they were actually 10 to 15 feet from the upline for Catfish Hotel, basically just in reach of it. But since they didn't know that, in their minds with the information they had, they figured they had two choices. Either continue into the Forbidden Spring or turn back and try to find what they believed was Catfish Hotel. Based on this false assumption, it seemed as simple as just backtracking to the last sinkhole and surfacing there. Unfortunately, that couldn't have been further from the case. Their traverse dive had just changed to an out and back, and for that type of dive, gas calculations are a little bit different. On an out and back dive, divers need to factor in something called turn pressure, which is the minimum air pressure needed to make it back to where they entered. This is because out and back dives often require divers to swim against the current on the way in or out, and that can have a big impact on the amount of gas a diver should bring. Either way, after making the decision to turn around, John calculated his turn pressure and he determined they would be cutting it close already. And that was before he felt how strong the current was. Swimming against any current requires more effort than swimming with one, and since more effort raises respiration rate, a diver can burn through an air supply far more quickly. And that is exactly what all of them were doing as they fought for every bit of forward progress. John's concern immediately grew as his breathing rate skyrocketed. He even grabbed hold of the guideline and pulled himself forward hand over hand to keep moving. But either way, with every foot of distance, they burned through their precious air supply. Thankfully though, shortly afterward, he reached the upline for Sioux Sink and he saw Billy ascending toward the surface ahead of him. Then he looked back and saw Mike and Dave making progress behind him. He then flashed an OK signal to them and he received one back. Then, thinking he didn't have much time to spare, he grabbed the upline and started his own ascent. Right at noon, Billy broke the surface and 5 minutes later, so did John. Both of Billy's tanks had just less than half their air supply remaining and only one of John's tanks was lower than Billy's. As they were checking this, they both knew they escaped what could have been a bad situation, but they still reserved any feeling of relief as they waited for the other two to surface, knowing that their tanks would likely be lower than their own. Then, when several minutes went by with no sign of Mike and Dave, John got his cell phone and called emergency services. Meanwhile, in the tunnel, Mike and Dave actually missed the upline for Sioux Sink and instead continued on toward their starting point, Freedman Sink. When Mike reached the uphill portion of that stretch of tunnel, he turned to check on Dave and saw his light wasn't far behind. Then when he reached the Freedman Sink upline, he immediately started ascending, believing that his father would be right behind him. He then broke the surface right at 12:20, and when he checked his tank pressure, he was alarmed to find one of his tanks completely empty and the other almost empty. By then, his father, who should have been right behind him, had been in the cave the longest of the four and still hadn't broken the surface at any of the sinkholes. 40 minutes later, just before 1 o'clock, emergency divers arrived, and by then it was clear what had happened. They then descended into the cave to look for Dave, and when they reached downstream of Freedman Sink, they found Dave's camera on the floor of the cave with its floodlight still glowing. Later, 2 divers from the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Team showed up and began a sweep of the cave system. Finally, they found Dave floating about midway through the uphill section near Freedman Sink. His air tanks had long been empty. In a later investigation by the National Speleological Society, it was determined that there were multiple events and circumstances that contributed to the loss. Importantly, they emphatically stated that the decision by all 4 of them to perform that particular dive in the first place is what doomed Dave. The current that runs through the Manatee Springs cave system makes it a siphon. Combine that with the traverse style of dive and you have conditions that would challenge even fully certified divers. One of the biggest problems the NSS also pointed out is that the divers didn't know about the high current and that their starting point set them up for failure. By entering Freedman Sink and swimming downstream, any need to turn around put them at risk of running out of air. Beyond that though, that's a factor that never should have come into play in the first place. Manatee Springs State Park has 2 main policies regarding diving. The first is that divers must be fully certified in cave diving to enter the system, and the second is that divers who have never been in the system must dive with someone who has. The 4 divers unfortunately had minimal cave diving training, and none of them bothered to learn more about the cave than what was communicated in the video they watched. The report also pointed blame at John first and then Mike. When John made it to Sioux Sink upline and signaled to Mike and Dave, he should have waited there for them to arrive so they knew where to ascend. Mike also later ascended Freedman Sink before Dave reached him. Finally, the NSS also assigns the last bit of blame to the creators of the YouTube video that inspired the dive. Serious cave divers are passionate about the safety of themselves and others in the sport, and urging unqualified divers to visit Manatee Springs was said to be irresponsible at best. As a final note, almost as if underscoring the difficulty of diving Manatee Springs, a year later in 2023, a highly experienced and properly certified diver who was with divers familiar with the cave lost his life when the current was so strong it pinned him to the ceiling of the cave and ripped his mask and rebreather system apart. Poland's deepest and largest known cave is named Śnieżna Cave. Its full name in Polish translates to Great Snowy Cave, and it's mainly located on the northern side of the Tatra Mountains. This range is a natural border between Poland and Slovakia, and the cave system actually has 5 separate entrances in different areas at different elevations. It was first discovered in 1959, and since then, Polish caving clubs have worked for decades to map the system. With each expedition, more and more unexplored areas have been discovered, including connections to other cave systems and even openings in nearby towns. Today, this massive limestone system has been mapped to a length of almost 15 miles or 24 kilometers and a depth of 2,703 feet or 824 meters. In the 1960s, cavers already actually reached almost 2,500 feet or 750 meters, but then in all the years since, because the deepest sections of the cave are so treacherous, cavers have only been able to go another 250 feet down. So in comparison to the miles and miles that were mapped early on, it's only been a trickle for more than 6 decades. However, that doesn't mean cavers aren't still trying. On August 15, 2019, a handful of cavers from the Wrocław Caving Club arrived in Śnieżna Cave to do just that. Among all of the clubs that have worked to map the system, these cavers were the most frequent visitors and knew the cave and its many tunnels and shafts well. This expedition planned to explore how the cave connected to a section called Szemkow Lot, almost 2,000 feet below the highest entry point. At around 8 p.m., 6 cavers crossed into the Great Snowy Cave, and the plan was to get some distance in and then set up camp for the night. In caves as large as this, it often requires several days of travel to get to the intended destination. So in the morning, the group planned to head for a second camp where they'd then split into 2 groups. So around 6 o'clock on the evening of the following day, 2 of the group members, Daniel and Josek, began making their way towards Szemkow Lot while the other 4 headed to a different section. Part of the reason for this split was that Szemkow Lot is a tangle of tight passages and tunnels, and the fewer cavers went that way, the better. It just wasn't the roomiest of areas for many people to occupy. Then, sometime before 9:30 that night, Daniel and Josek were in a particularly tight and claustrophobic section when something unexpected happened. Heavy rains began on and off for days in the Tatras, and the rainwater had finally accumulated enough to rush into the Great Snowy Cave. The 2 men had begun making their way back to the second camp when they were shocked to learn that the way out had been flooded. Then, when they failed to show up at the camp at the agreed upon time, the other cavers went to search for them, and like Daniel and Josek, the sight of the air was shocking. The passages the other group knew the 2 men had gone through were completely submerged in water. Luckily, the others were able to make contact with the 2 men by screaming as loud as they could, even through the rock walls. Daniel and Josek then replied that they couldn't get through with the tunnel flooded. It was such an enclosed space that every inch had to be carefully navigated. Getting through just a few feet would require much more time than they could hold their breath for. However, at the same time, they couldn't just sit around and wait either, because every half hour they checked the water level and found it was slowly rising still. Several hours later at 2 a.m. on August 17, the others returned to the second camp, and the only thing they could do was hurry out of the cave as quickly as they could to get help. The problem was that leaving the cave takes about twice as long as descending. So by the time they got cell reception, it was 5 p.m., over 12 hours since they left the other 2 men. Their call was then received by the Tatra Mountain Search and Rescue Team, known as TOPR, and the rescue effort began right away, but it was extremely complicated. Reaching the closest entrance to the cave as quickly as possible would require a helicopter, and the tunnels were so tight where the men were, which would severely limit the number of rescuers that could be down there at a time. Either way, within 2 hours of being informed, the first members of the team arrived and were ready to start making their way through the cave system. Led by one of the 4 original cavers who left the cave to get help, the rescue effort officially got underway at 8 o'clock, 48 hours after the Wrocław group entered the cave to begin the expedition. Then, finally, at 3 a.m., so by then, 24 hours after the men were trapped, the team was outside the flooded section and assessing the situation. From what they could tell, there were two ways to get to the men. One was the way they went in, which was flooded, and the other was through an area that was always flooded. However, the rescuers determined that sending divers in that way was out of the question. This meant that their only hope of getting them out was the once dry but also extremely tight passage. The approach the team came up with was to use explosives to widen the tunnel, but that would take time the rescuers likely wouldn't have, because in attempting to make voice contact once they got outside the passage, rescuers received no response from the men. The conditions on the other side of the flood were not clear, so not receiving a response was immediately concerning. Whether they were trapped inside the tunnel or a larger dry section within the passage, the two would likely be completely soaked to the bone in freezing cold water. At their depth as well, carbon monoxide levels would also be much higher than above ground. So already by that evening, TOPR officials believed that the men could be in a deep state of hypothermia, and rescuers were barely any closer to them. Each time the rescue team used explosives to widen the tunnels, they'd need to remain outside of the cave for at least 2 or 3 hours for the dust to settle and the smoke to clear. The charges also created even more dangerous carbon monoxide gas, and it just wasn't safe for rescuers to work in those conditions. As for Daniel and Yosik, things weren't looking good as time went forward. Contact still hadn't been made, and in the afternoon of August 19th, the TOPR chief told the media gathered nearby that the chances of survival by that point were extremely thin. The effort to save the men continued regardless, but work had slowed dramatically. Without a way to get bad air out faster after widening the tunnel, every inch seemed to take hours. To solve this, rescuers began constructing a ventilation system on August 20th, but the effect was minimal. In addition, although the walls had been blasted to around 16 feet wide, going from just a few feet wide to 16 meant there was a lot of rock debris that needed to be cleared from the area, which was a challenge in itself. This was in fact so time-consuming that TOPR officials started to reconsider trying to reach the men through the passage that was always flooded, but unfortunately a second assessment proved that it was still too risky. Thankfully though, as it neared 4 o'clock that afternoon, the first major breakthrough came. With much of the passage entrance blown out, Daniel and Yosik's equipment was located by the lead group of rescuers. Among the items were 2 harnesses, some food, and a damaged drill. Then, later that night, the rescue team received their most encouraging yet also most alarming sign since the rescue began. Through the rock, they could hear one of the men snoring, meaning at least one was still alive. Unlike regular snoring though, this sound was more of a gurgling snore and indicated that time was quickly running out. There was no doubt by then that they were in the last throes of hypothermia and they needed medical attention immediately. As work continued and the first few minutes of August 21st went by, rescuers faced a new problem. Not only had the circumstances and conditions inside the cave made the effort complex and difficult, they had to stop what they were doing for the most unnecessary reason. Unauthorized locals had gotten into the cave to get a better look at the rescue operation. This resulted in the rescue team having to halt the widening of the cave and devote resources to chasing them out. These locals had also gained access through one of the other cave entrances, so more resources were then needed to guard the other ways in. Another 12 hours later, rescuers could feel they were getting close to the men, but based on the noises that were heard the night before, things were not looking good. Then, tragically, from the blasting, the weakened tunnel roof collapsed around the 985-foot or 300-meter mark. It was all but certain by then that there would be no rescue, only the hope of a body recovery eventually. Thankfully, no one was in the area when it happened, but the fall destroyed the ropes that had been rigged and the ventilation system. The entrance to the fissure the men were believed to be in was also completely blocked. But with no other options, the rescuers began removing the fallen rocks in the passage in order to start the process all over again. Finally, at 10 o'clock that night, word made it to leadership outside that visual contact had been made with one of the men. They couldn't reach him yet, but he wasn't moving or responding to the rescuers. It was unclear which of the men it was, but it was clear that he was dead. Then, the next morning, TOPR announced to the media that they were now in a recovery operation under the assumption that both men were dead. The one dead caver they found was lying wedged inside a narrow pipe, which led rescuers to believe that the 2 men got stuck attempting to rescue themselves and possibly drowned. It was also suggested that the men themselves were obstructing the flow of water so much that it accumulated around them until they were consumed by it. Understandably, the Wrocław Caving Club took exception to the assumption that both men were dead and appealed to the Polish Prime Minister to force TOPR to resume rescue operations, but the decision stood. On August 24th, a piece of cloth was located in the tunnel that was believed to belong to the second caver, who wouldn't be extracted from the cave all the way until September 5th. An autopsy later performed on both men revealed that the men died of hypothermia and did not drown, although obviously neither fate was preferable. On September 17th, the last of the equipment used in the operation was removed from the cave, 1 month to the day Daniel and Yosik were reported trapped. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, I'd love to hear it, and you could submit it to the form found in the description. In particular, if you have any caving stories you'd like to see covered, they're getting harder and harder to come by, so any that you know would be awesome. Thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.